Welcome to English 2450, COM 2010, Week 11, Lecture Video Number 1 on Sound Design, the Basics. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of a history of different film technologies so that we can think about how recorded sound fits into the overall history of film production. So we know that film technology, the moving picture, the moving image, was invented in the late 1800s, and that film editing was invented around 1910. Color film stock was first invented in 1920 or so, although directors were hand coloring or having someone hand color film stock before that as early as 1902. Now, recorded sound comes onto the scene in 1926. So by this point, the moving image had existed for probably nearly 50 years, really. Maybe closer to like 40 or so. But film and the kind of early predecessors of film had existed for a while before recorded sound was actually part of the filmmaking process. So a lot of times people think that, silent films, like those before 1926 or those after 1926 that decided not to use the soundtrack function, which was developed at that time, that they didn't use sound in the same way that we kind of think of modern Hollywood films, therefore sound wasn't important in those films. But that's actually not the case. Sound has always been an important part of film, going back as far as film itself, right? So even though silent films did not include recorded sound, they were always played alongside an orchestra, an organ, or a piano. And the music played by, the kind of the live musician who's sitting there and playing along with the film was very important to the overall kind of feeling and experience of going to a movie in those early years. So sound has always been an important kind of piece of the puzzle, even before it was recorded alongside the film strip and played with the film itself. So I'll show an example here of what an analog film strip looks like. So you can see here an analog film strip. This arrow is pointing to the soundtrack, right? So in 1926, they developed a way to add a soundtrack directly onto a strip of film here. So this is when you begin to get sound films with an audio track directly kind of linked to the film strip itself, rather than playing something, like a piano or an organ being played sort of separately, or even some kind of theaters would play like a record on a phonograph at the same time that a film was playing as well. But the important thing to remember here is that even though the soundtrack, the official kind of film soundtrack, wasn't invented until 1926, sound has always been an important part of cinema. Sound has always been an important part of cinema. Even though we think of film as primarily a visual medium, right? Film is something you see. Sound has always been important, like I said, even in silent cinema. And Bordwell and Thompson, the authors of the textbook Film Art, say to study sound, we must learn to listen to films. So we quite often say that, well, I'm going to go watch a movie, I'm going to watch a film. But we also listen to films, right? What we hear is as important as what we see quite often. So I really want you to kind of take this week in these lectures as a reminder that, film is something we also listen to, and that it's really incredibly important to listen closely and to think about how sound in film is important. Now, another kind of thing to consider here is that films have designed sound, that the sound is not random or circumstantial or just whatever the mics picked up during the process of filming. Sound, especially in post-1970s film, is very much a designed aspect of the film, just as much as anything else is, right? We acknowledge that the camera angles are intentional, that if the camera's moving or still, that if the editor makes a cut or does a dissolve or allows for a long take, that the visual design, the costumes, the settings, all of these things are designed and intentional and important. Sound is the same in film. Sound is the same. It's also designed. So in the 1970s, there was a shift in Hollywood to integrate sound design into all parts of the filmmaking process. So prior to the 1970s, sound was kind of an afterthought. It was important, but it was kind of the last thing, right? So rather than designing the sound of a film at the beginning, before you start filming, like you would design the visuals of a film, sound design was something that was done after the fact, right? And in the 1970s, there's this shift where people working in sound said, well, why don't we start this process a little bit earlier? So during pre-production and during the shooting phase, why don't we work on developing the sound throughout that entire period of time? And then our sound can be tighter and cleaner and clearer and more functional. It can do what we want it to do. So Walter Murch is actually the person that coined the term sound designer. You might remember Walter Murch from the documentary you watched, The Cutting Edge, The Magic of Movie Editing. He's a film editor, but film editors also work on sound design because the editing process and the sound design process go hand in hand. And you'll see more about why that is the case. So he actually designed the term, or coined the term sound designer to describe what he did on the film Apocalypse Now. So Apocalypse Now is often considered one of the first films to ever have a quote-unquote sound designer, someone who specifically and explicitly designed the sound of the film. This is what the film will sound like. Now, in contemporary sound design, there are three kind of key components that most sound designers, at least in Hollywood, adhere to. The first one is that sound should be integrated into all parts of production, right? That sound should be a consideration during the pre-production phase, during shooting, during editing, during post. That at all of the different stages of filmmaking, sound should be an important consideration. The second consideration here is that sound is as expressive as the image. Sound can express just as much information, if not more, than the image itself. So sound is key. It is absolutely integral to the nature of film. And then the third consideration of contemporary sound design is that image and sound can create different worlds. Image and sound can create different worlds. So although we typically think of the image and the sound working together to create one kind of idea or one kind of world, it's important to remember that image and sound can run counter to each other, can be working on different things. So the image might be telling us one thing and the sound could be telling us something completely different. So it's important to remember that yes, image and sound can work together, but they don't always. Sometimes they actually run counter to each other, and the sound might undercut something happening in the image, or vice versa, right? So these are important things to consider. That sound has always been an important part of the filmmaking process, even before recorded sound was introduced in 1926. Silent films did utilize sound in one way or another, whether it was recorded, played separate from the film, or live music played on by an orchestra on an organ or a piano. And that contemporary sound design, especially after the 1970s, is very much focused on what sound is capable of doing, how to integrate sound design throughout the filmmaking process, and how sound and images can work together or can work against each other. Now, in the next videos, I'll be talking about some of the key players in the sound production process, the different stages of sound production, the perceptual properties and dimensions of sound, rhythm, fidelity, space, and time, and how sound functions, what sound is actually able to accomplish in filmmaking. So stay tuned for those additional videos.